My stepmother tried to steal our family home while Dad was dying, and that's when I discovered she'd been planning to take everything from his children for years. Have you ever trusted someone so completely with your family's future that you welcomed them into your most sacred spaces and shared your deepest grief with them? I did. Her name was Rebecca, and she was the woman my father married 3 years after my mother died of cancer. What I didn't know was that behind her caring second wife smile, Rebecca had been systematically manipulating my dying father, poisoning him against his own children, and rewriting his will to steal the inheritance my mother had worked her entire life to build. The betrayal happened on a Thursday morning in November, exactly 2 weeks after Dad's pancreatic cancer diagnosis, when I came to the house to help with his medical appointments and found Rebecca packing my mother's china into boxes. The moment I saw her wrapping my mother's wedding dishes in newspaper like unwanted clutter, I realized the woman I'd called Mom for 3 years had been planning this moment since the day she said, "I do." My name is Sophia. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital. Until 3 weeks ago, I thought Rebecca genuinely loved my father and cared about our family's well-being during the most difficult time of our lives. I thought she was grateful to be included in my father's final months, honored to help him make decisions about his medical care, and committed to supporting his children through the grief of losing our second parent. I was wrong about everything. Sometimes the people who hold your hand during your darkest moments are the same people who've been planning to rob you while you're too devastated to protect yourself. The house that Rebecca was trying to steal had been in our family for 26 years. My parents had bought the 4-bedroom Victorian on Elm Street when I was 6 years old, back when Dad was a high school principal and Mom was a librarian who dreamed of filling every room with books and children's laughter. My younger siblings Jake and Emma had grown up in that house. Jake was now 16 and a junior in high school. Emma was 14 and in 8th grade. The house contained every memory of our mother: her garden, her reading nook, the kitchen where she'd taught us to bake Christmas cookies, the living room where she'd read us bedtime stories even when we were too old for them. Rebecca wasn't just stealing property. She was erasing the physical evidence of our mother's love and our family's history. Mom had died 4 years ago after an 18-month battle with breast cancer that had drained our family's savings and left Dad emotionally shattered. The house was the only thing of value that remained from their 30-year marriage, and Mom's final wish had been that it would always be a home for her children. Rebecca had appeared in Dad's life 18 months after Mom's funeral, meeting him at a grief support group where she presented herself as a widow who understood the pain of losing a life partner. She was 51, elegant, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely interested in helping Dad heal from his devastating loss. I'd encouraged their relationship because I thought Dad deserved companionship during his remaining years, and because Rebecca seemed to respect Mom's memory and understand that she was joining a family rather than replacing its foundation. But what I thought was respect for our mother's legacy was actually a calculated study of what Rebecca would need to erase in order to claim our father's life as her own. Dad's cancer diagnosis had come suddenly, a routine physical that revealed tumors that had been growing silently for months. The oncologist gave him 6 to 12 months with treatment, maybe 3 without it. Rebecca had immediately stepped into the role of primary caregiver, organizing his medical appointments, researching treatment options, and managing his medications with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning for this responsibility. I'd been grateful for her support because watching my father face terminal illness while trying to care for 2 teenagers was overwhelming for someone working full-time in a demanding job. But when I walked into the kitchen that Thursday morning and saw Rebecca sorting through Mom's belongings as if she'd been waiting years for permission to dispose of them, I realized that Dad's illness hadn't been a crisis for Rebecca. It had been an opportunity. "What are you doing with Mom's dishes?" I asked, gripping the doorframe for support. Rebecca looked up from wrapping Mom's favorite serving bowl, the one we used for every holiday dinner, with the casual confidence of someone who owned everything she was touching. I'm making space for my own things, she said without any trace of embarrassment. David and I discussed this, and he agreed that it's time to let go of items that represent painful memories. Those aren't painful memories, they're family heirlooms. They're reminders of a life that's over, Sophia. Your father needs to focus on his future, not his past. In that moment, watching my stepmother pack away my mother's memory like unwanted clutter, I realized I wasn't looking at a grieving wife preparing for loss. I was looking at a woman who'd been waiting for my father to die so she could claim everything he'd built with his first family. Dad wouldn't want you to throw away Mom's things. Rebecca smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd already won a battle I didn't know we were fighting. Actually, Sophia, your father signed papers last week transferring ownership of this house to me. He wants to make sure I'm taken care of after he's gone. Have you ever felt your entire world collapse while you're standing perfectly still? That's what happened when I realized my father's final months weren't just about managing his medical care. They were about watching everything my mother had worked for disappear into the hands of a woman who'd spent 3 years studying our family weaknesses and waiting for the perfect moment to exploit them. Because the woman I'd trusted with my father's happiness had been planning to steal our inheritance, and she'd just revealed that she might have already succeeded. Before I tell you how my stepmother nearly succeeded in stealing our family's legacy, let me tell you who we were before betrayal destroyed our trust in the woman we'd welcomed as our second mother. I'm Sophia Martinez, 32 years old, and I've been a pediatric nurse for 8 years. I became the unofficial head of our family when Mom died, helping Dad navigate single parenthood while working full-time and grieving the loss of his life partner. My parents, David and Maria Martinez, had built their marriage on shared values of family loyalty, hard work, and creating security for their children. Dad was a high school principal who'd worked double shifts during summer breaks to pay for family vacations. Mom was a librarian who'd saved every extra dollar to ensure we could afford college educations. They'd sacrificed their own luxuries for 26 years to build something lasting for their children, never imagining that a second wife would erase their life's work in less than 3 years. When Mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, our family faced the disease with the same unity that had carried us through every previous challenge. Dad took early retirement to care for her full-time. Jake and Emma, who were 12 and 10 at the time, learned to help with household tasks and homework supervision while I managed Mom's medical appointments around my nursing schedule. Mom fought her cancer with incredible grace, determined to see her children graduate from high school and start their adult lives. During her final weeks, she made Dad promise that Jake and Emma would always have the security of our family home, no matter what challenges life brought after her death. "The house is their anchor," she'd whispered during one of our last conversations. "Promise me they'll never have to worry about having a place that's truly theirs." Dad had promised, holding her hand and assuring her that their children's security would always be his first priority. That promise would become the weapon Rebecca used against him when grief made him vulnerable to manipulation. After Mom's funeral, Dad struggled with depression and isolation that worried all of us. He'd lost his life partner, his sense of purpose, and his confidence in his ability to raise teenagers alone. Jake was acting out at school, Emma was withdrawn and refusing to talk about her feelings, and I was overwhelmed trying to support everyone while managing my own grief. When Dad joined a grief support group 18 months later, I thought it was a positive step toward healing. When he mentioned meeting a woman named Rebecca who'd also lost her spouse, I encouraged him to develop friendships with people who understood his experience. Rebecca seemed perfect for Dad's emotional needs. She was a retired nurse who'd cared for her first husband during his battle with lung cancer, so she understood both caregiving stress and spousal grief. She was patient with Jake's behavioral problems and gentle with Emma's shyness. She seemed to respect Mom's memory and never tried to replace her role in our family. Looking back, I realize Rebecca wasn't trying to replace our mother. She was studying her so she could erase her more effectively. When Dad and Rebecca married in a small courthouse ceremony 2 years after Mom's death, I gave a toast celebrating the idea that love could heal even the deepest grief. Rebecca had tears in her eyes as she thanked me for welcoming her into our family and promised to honor the legacy Mom had created. "I know I can never replace your mother," she'd said, hugging me after the ceremony. "But I hope I can add something meaningful to the family she built with such love." Rebecca moved into our family home, bringing only a few personal belongings and insisting that everything should remain exactly as Mom had arranged it. She said she wanted to preserve the atmosphere that had made Dad happy for so many years. She helped Jake with his homework using Mom's patient teaching style. She attended Emma's school events and cheered enthusiastically for her achievements. She cooked family dinners using Mom's recipes and maintained Mom's garden with careful attention to every plant and flower. What I thought was respect for our mother's memory was actually a performance designed to gain our trust, while she learned everything she'd need to know to replace our family dynamic with her own preferences. For the first year of their marriage, Rebecca seemed like the answer to prayers I'd been afraid to voice. Dad was happier than he'd been since Mom's diagnosis. The kids were adjusting well to having a maternal figure in their lives again, and I felt relief at no longer being the only adult responsible for our family's emotional stability. Rebecca encouraged Dad to start dating again before they met, supported his decision to return to work part-time, and even helped him begin socializing with friends he'd avoided during his depression. She was patient, supportive, and seemingly content to build her happiness around our existing family structure. But during the second year of their marriage, subtle changes began that I didn't recognize as warning signs because they seemed like natural evolution of their relationship. Rebecca started expressing opinions about our family traditions that differed from Mom's approaches. She suggested that Jake might benefit from stricter discipline than Dad had been providing. She thought Emma was too dependent on her siblings and needed encouragement to develop independence. Rebecca was gradually introducing ideas that would isolate Dad from his children and make him dependent on her judgment about family decisions. When Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Rebecca immediately assumed the role of primary caregiver and medical advocate. She researched treatment options, organized his appointments, and managed his medications with professional competence that made everyone grateful for her presence. I thought we were lucky that Dad had a wife with medical experience who could navigate his cancer treatment, while the rest of us dealt with the emotional devastation of facing another parent's terminal illness. What I didn't understand was that Dad's cancer diagnosis hadn't been a family crisis for Rebecca. It had been the opportunity she'd been waiting for to execute a plan she'd been developing since their wedding day. By the time I found her packing Mom's china, Rebecca had spent 3 years studying our family dynamics, identifying our emotional vulnerabilities, and positioning herself as the indispensable center of Dad's life. She'd learned everything she needed to know about our weaknesses, and now she was using Dad's terminal illness as cover for stealing everything Mom had worked to build for her children. The first crack in Rebecca's perfect stepmother facade appeared during Dad's second oncology appointment, but I was too focused on his medical crisis to recognize it as the beginning of systematic manipulation. Sometimes the most dangerous betrayals begin with helpful gestures that make you grateful to the person who's planning to destroy you. I'd taken the day off work to accompany Dad and Rebecca to meet with his oncologist and discuss treatment options. Dad had been feeling overwhelmed by medical terminology and prognosis statistics, so I wanted to be there as his advocate and to help him process whatever information we received. When we arrived at the cancer center, Rebecca immediately took charge of the check-in process, presenting herself as Dad's primary emergency contact and medical decision-maker. She'd brought a detailed list of his medications, symptoms, and questions for the doctor. "I've researched pancreatic cancer extensively," she told the nurse. "I want to make sure we're considering all available options for David's specific situation." I was impressed by her preparation and grateful that someone was organized enough to ensure Dad received comprehensive care. I thought Rebecca was being thorough. I didn't realize she was establishing herself as the authority figure in Dad's medical treatment, while positioning me as a secondary support person. During the appointment, the oncologist explained that Dad's cancer was stage 4 with metastasis to his liver, which meant treatment would focus on extending life and managing symptoms rather than pursuing a cure. The median survival rate was 6 to 12 months, though some patients lived longer with aggressive treatment. Rebecca asked detailed questions about treatment side effects, quality of life impacts, and palliative care options. She took notes on everything the doctor said and requested copies of all medical reports. Dad seemed grateful to have someone managing the overwhelming details of his diagnosis while he processed the emotional reality of terminal cancer. But when the doctor asked Dad about his support system and family dynamics, Rebecca answered before Dad could speak. David has 3 children from his first marriage, she explained. Sophia is an adult who lives independently, but Jake and Emma are still in high school and living at home. I'll be managing David's care and maintaining stability for the younger children. Rebecca was describing our family structure as if I were a distant relative rather than Dad's eldest child and healthcare proxy. What about extended family support? The doctor asked. David's first wife passed away several years ago, and her family isn't local, Rebecca replied. I'm really his primary support system now, along with the children when they're available. I felt strange listening to Rebecca discuss our family dynamics without including me in the conversation, but I assumed she was just being efficient about providing medical background information. After the appointment, Rebecca suggested that she and Dad go to lunch to discuss treatment decisions privately, while I returned to work since I'd already taken most of the day off. You've been so helpful, she said, hugging me goodbye. But I know you need to get back to your patients, and David and I should probably process this information together before involving the whole family. Rebecca was dismissing me from Dad's medical crisis while making it seem like she was being considerate of my schedule. I can stay longer if Dad wants me to, I offered. That's sweet, honey, but your father and I need time to discuss some private matters about his care preferences and end-of-life planning, adult conversations that might be too stressful for you to hear right now. Adult conversations. As if I weren't a 32-year-old medical professional who'd helped manage Mom's cancer treatment and was fully capable of participating in discussions about Dad's care. But Dad seemed comfortable with Rebecca's suggestion, so I hugged him goodbye and returned to work, assuming they would share whatever decisions they made during our next family conversation. That evening, when I called to check on Dad and ask about their lunch discussion, Rebecca answered the phone. David is resting, she said. Today was very overwhelming for him, and I think he needs space to process his diagnosis without having to explain his feelings to everyone who calls. I'm not everyone, I'm his daughter. Of course you are, sweetheart. But right now, what David needs most is calm, quiet support from someone who can handle his medical crisis without adding emotional pressure. Rebecca was suggesting that my concern for my dying father was somehow burdensome rather than loving. Can I just talk to him for 5 minutes? He's already taken his evening medications and he's trying to sleep. Why don't you call tomorrow evening, and I'll make sure he's available to talk then. Rebecca was managing access to my own father as if she were a medical facility with visiting hours rather than a family member facilitating communication. But she presented her control as protection for Dad's well-being, making me feel selfish for wanting to talk to my terminally ill father whenever I needed reassurance that he was okay. Rebecca was training me to accept restrictions on my relationship with Dad by framing my natural impulses as threats to his recovery. The next evening, when I called at the time Rebecca had specified, she answered again and told me that Dad was having a difficult day and wasn't up for conversation. Maybe you could try calling every other day instead of daily, she suggested. I think the frequency of phone calls is adding stress to his routine. I've called him every day for 4 years. Since Mom died, daily check-ins have been our normal routine. But David isn't the same person he was before his diagnosis. His needs have changed, and his family needs to adjust their expectations to match his current limitations. Rebecca was rewriting our family history, making my long-standing relationship with Dad seem inappropriate for his new circumstances. She was isolating Dad from his children while making us feel like we were being considerate of his needs rather than being pushed away from his care. By the end of that first week after his diagnosis, Rebecca had established herself as the gatekeeper for Dad's emotional and medical care, and I'd been trained to accept her authority because questioning it seemed selfish and unsupportive. I thought I was respecting Dad's need for quiet recovery time. I didn't realize I was allowing Rebecca to cut me out of the most important decisions of my father's life. During the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention to the subtle ways Rebecca was controlling information about Dad's condition, and what I observed made me realize that his cancer treatment was becoming secondary to her personal agenda. Sometimes clarity comes not from dramatic revelations, but from finally noticing patterns that have been hiding behind helpful gestures. I'd begun visiting Dad every other evening after work, respecting Rebecca's schedule while trying to maintain connection during his treatment. But each visit felt increasingly strange, as if I were a guest being managed rather than a daughter spending time with her dying father. Rebecca would greet me at the door with updates about Dad's condition, energy levels, and mood before I could see him for myself. She'd prepare me for what to expect during our conversation and suggest topics that would be uplifting rather than stressful for him. David had a difficult morning with nausea, she'd say, so try to keep the conversation light. Maybe talk about work stories or happy memories instead of asking how he's feeling. Rebecca was editing my relationship with Dad, deciding what I was allowed to discuss with my own dying father. During our conversations, Dad seemed more distant than I'd expected, given the seriousness of his diagnosis. Instead of wanting to discuss his fears, his hopes for Jake and Emma's futures, or his wishes for our family after his death, he mostly talked about practical matters that Rebecca had apparently highlighted as important. Rebecca thinks we should consider selling the house, he mentioned during one visit. The maintenance might be too much for her to handle alone after I'm gone. Dad, you don't need to worry about that right now. Focus on your treatment. But Rebecca researched the real estate market, and she thinks now might be a good time to sell while property values are high. Rebecca was using Dad's terminal diagnosis as an opportunity to discuss financial decisions that would benefit her rather than his children. What would happen to Jake and Emma if you sold the house? Rebecca has some ideas about that. She thinks they might be better off in a smaller place that's easier to manage. Dad was repeating Rebecca's opinions as if they were his own thoughts, and he seemed to have forgotten his promise to Mom about maintaining the family home for his children. When I tried to remind him of that conversation, Dad looked confused. I don't remember making any specific promises about the house, he said. Rebecca says that people with terminal illnesses sometimes have unrealistic expectations about what their families can handle after they're gone. Rebecca was erasing Dad's memories of commitments he'd made to our mother and replacing them with her preferred narrative about our family's future. The most alarming change was in Dad's relationship with Jake and Emma. When I asked how they were handling his diagnosis, Dad's answers suggested that Rebecca had been reporting behavioral problems that I hadn't observed. Jake has been disrespectful about his curfew, Dad said. Rebecca thinks he's acting out because he can't handle the stress of my illness. What kind of disrespectful behavior? Coming home 15 minutes late, arguing about homework time, not cleaning his room properly. Rebecca says these are signs that he needs more structure and consequences. I'd spent time with Jake recently, and while he was obviously struggling with Dad's diagnosis, his behavior seemed normal for a 16-year-old dealing with family crisis. The problems Rebecca was reporting sounded like typical teenage behavior that had been reframed as concerning rebellion. Rebecca was pathologizing normal teenage responses to family stress in order to justify stricter control over Jake and Emma's lives. What about Emma? How is she doing? Rebecca is concerned that she's too dependent on you for emotional support. She thinks Emma should be learning to cope with feelings on her own instead of calling you when she's upset. Emma had been calling me more frequently since Dad's diagnosis, which seemed natural for a 14-year-old who was facing the loss of her second parent. But Rebecca was presenting my sister's need for emotional support as unhealthy dependency rather than normal grief response. I don't mind Emma calling me. I want her to feel supported during this time. Rebecca thinks it might be better if Emma learned to talk to her about her feelings instead of always running to her older sister. She says Emma needs to accept that I have a new wife now and that family dynamics have changed. Rebecca was systematically isolating Dad's children from each other and from him, while positioning herself as the new center of our family structure. The most disturbing conversation happened during my third week of managed visits, when Dad mentioned that Rebecca had been researching boarding schools for Emma. Rebecca thinks Emma might benefit from a more structured environment with professional counseling support, Dad explained. She says that watching a parent die of cancer can be traumatic for teenagers, and specialized schools know how to help kids process grief in healthy ways. Dad, Emma doesn't need boarding school. She needs her family during the most difficult time of her life. Rebecca has experience with these situations from her nursing career. She knows what's best for teenagers who are dealing with parental loss. Rebecca was using her medical background to justify separating Emma from our family during Dad's final months, which would eliminate any witness to her manipulation and give her complete control over Dad's environment. I was watching my stepmother systematically dismantle our family structure while convincing my dying father that her control was in everyone's best interest. That night, I called Jake and Emma to ask about their experiences with Rebecca since Dad's diagnosis. What they told me confirmed that Rebecca's helpful management of our family was actually calculated manipulation designed to isolate Dad from his children and eliminate any opposition to her authority. The woman we'd trusted to care for our father during his final months was actually using his terminal illness as cover for stealing everything our mother had worked to build for her children. The first real confrontation happened on a Saturday morning when I arrived at the house unannounced and found Rebecca showing our family home to a real estate agent while Dad was upstairs sleeping. Sometimes you don't realize you're being robbed until you catch the thief in the act of selling your stolen property. I'd driven over to bring Dad his favorite soup from the deli where Mom used to take us for lunch, thinking a surprise visit might give us time to talk without Rebecca's careful supervision. What I found was a professionally dressed woman taking photographs of our living room while Rebecca pointed out recent updates and original architectural features. "What's going on here?" I asked from the doorway. Rebecca looked startled for about 3 seconds before regaining her composure. "Sophia, honey, I wasn't expecting you today. Who is this woman, and why is she photographing our house?" "This is Janet Morrison from Hillside Realty," Rebecca replied smoothly. "We're getting a market evaluation so David can make informed decisions about his financial planning." Rebecca was presenting the sale of our family home as responsible financial planning rather than theft of our inheritance. "Where's Dad?" "He's resting upstairs. Yesterday's chemo session was particularly difficult, and he needs quiet time to recover." I walked toward the staircase to check on Dad, but Rebecca stepped in front of me. "Sophia, I don't think you should disturb him right now. He had a very restless night, and he finally fell asleep about an hour ago." "I'm not going to wake him up. I just want to see how he's doing." "Your father specifically asked me to make sure he wasn't disturbed until this afternoon. If you want to visit, maybe you could come back around 3 o'clock when he's feeling stronger." Rebecca was using Dad's medical condition to prevent me from witnessing her secret meeting with a real estate agent. "Ms. Morrison," I said, addressing the realtor directly, "I'm David's daughter. Can you explain why you're evaluating our house without his children being informed?" The realtor looked uncomfortable, glancing between Rebecca and me as if she sensed family tension, but wasn't sure how to navigate it. "Mrs. Martinez asked me to provide a market analysis for estate planning purposes. she said carefully. This is actually quite common when families are dealing with serious illness. Estate planning is one thing, but taking photographs and measurements suggests you're preparing for an actual sale. Rebecca's smile became strained. Sophia, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. David and I are simply exploring all options for managing his financial affairs during his illness. What financial affairs? Dad owns this house outright. His pension and insurance should cover his medical expenses. There are many costs associated with terminal cancer that insurance doesn't cover, Rebecca replied with the authority of someone who'd researched the topic extensively. Experimental treatments, specialized care, modifications to make the house accessible if David becomes wheelchair-bound. We need to know what resources are available if we need to access them. Rebecca was creating financial emergencies that didn't exist in order to justify selling the one asset that represented security for Dad's children. Even if Dad needed money for medical expenses, selling the house wouldn't be the first option. He could take out a home equity loan or modify his insurance coverage. Sophia, honey, I understand that you're attached to this house because of your childhood memories, but right now, David's health has to be the priority. Rebecca was reframing my objection to her house sale as selfish attachment to childhood nostalgia rather than legitimate concern about our family's inheritance. This house isn't just childhood memories, it's our mother's legacy and the security she wanted her children to have. Your mother has been gone for 4 years. David's life has moved forward, and his priorities have changed. He has a new wife now, and he needs to think about what's best for his current family situation. Rebecca was erasing our mother's importance in Dad's life while establishing herself as his current family, in contrast to his children from his previous marriage. His current family situation includes Jake and Emma, who are still in high school and need a stable home. Jake and Emma will be taken care of, but David has responsibilities to his wife as well as his children. He needs to make sure I'm financially secure after he's gone. Dad has life insurance and Social Security benefits that will provide for you. You don't need to sell our family home to be financially secure. Rebecca's patience was clearly wearing thin. Sophia, these are complex financial decisions that involve many factors you don't understand. David and I have discussed this extensively, and he's comfortable with our planning approach. Then I'd like to discuss it with Dad directly. David is too ill to handle stressful conversations about finances and real estate. That's why he's asked me to manage these matters for him. Rebecca was using Dad's cancer treatment as an excuse to make major financial decisions without his children's input or even his conscious participation. I looked at the real estate agent, who was clearly uncomfortable with the family conflict she'd witnessed. Ms. Morrison, I need to inform you that this house belongs to our entire family, and any sale would need to involve all of David's children in the decision-making process. Rebecca stepped forward. Actually, Sophia, the house belongs to David and me as married couple. His children don't have any legal ownership stake in our marital property. That's not true. This house was purchased during Dad's first marriage, and Mom's estate has inheritance rights that protect her children's interests. You'll find that David's will has been updated since our marriage to reflect his current wishes and legal obligations. In that moment, I realized that Rebecca hadn't just been planning to sell our house. She'd already taken legal steps to ensure that she would inherit everything when Dad died. What do you mean his will has been updated? Rebecca smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone revealing a victory she'd already secured. David and I consulted with an estate planning attorney last month. His will now reflects his commitment to his current marriage and his desire to ensure that I'm properly cared for after his death. I was staring at a woman who'd spent 3 years gaining my father's trust so she could steal his children's inheritance while he was too sick to understand what he was signing. The full truth about Rebecca's plans came out the next day, When I arrived at the house with a copy of Mom's will and demanded to see the documents Dad had supposedly signed, giving Rebecca control of our family's assets. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals are revealed through legal documents that show months of careful planning disguised as loving concern. I'd spent the entire night researching inheritance law and reviewing the paperwork from Mom's estate that I'd kept in my files since her death. What I discovered was that Rebecca's claim about marital property was legally questionable, and Dad's new will might not have the authority she thought it did. When I rang the doorbell the next morning, Rebecca answered with the wary expression of someone who'd been expecting a confrontation. "Sophia, this really isn't a good time. David had a difficult night, and he's not up for visitors today." "I'm not here to visit. I'm here to see the will you claim Dad signed last month." Rebecca's smile became coldly polite. "That's a private legal document between David and his wife. It's not something his children have a right to review." "Actually, as Dad's daughter and Mom's heir, I do have legal standing to review any documents that affect our family's estate." Rebecca's confidence wavered slightly as she realized I'd done legal research rather than accepting her claims about Dad's authority to dispose of family assets. "Sophia, I think you're misunderstanding the legal realities of your father's situation. When David married me, his estate planning obligations changed significantly. That depends on how the house was originally titled and what provisions Mom made for her children's inheritance." I pulled out the folder I'd brought and showed Rebecca a copy of the deed to our house, which clearly showed that Mom and Dad had owned the property as tenants by the entirety, with right of survivorship to heirs. According to this deed, when Mom died, her ownership interest passed to her children, with Dad retaining a life estate. He can live here until he dies, but he can't sell the house or transfer ownership without our consent. Rebecca's face went completely white as she stared at the legal document I was holding. "That's impossible. Our attorney assured us that David had full ownership rights to all marital property." "What attorney?" "Because any competent estate lawyer would have required him to disclose the existence of this deed before drafting a new will." Rebecca was discovering that her months of legal planning had been based on incomplete information about our family's actual ownership structure. "I want to see Dad right now," I continued. "I want to ask him directly whether he knew about this deed when he signed whatever documents you've been waving around." "David is sleeping, and his doctors have specifically instructed that he not be disturbed during his recovery periods." "Then I'll wait until he wakes up." I walked past Rebecca into our family's living room and sat down in Dad's favorite chair with my folder of legal documents. Rebecca followed me with the expression of someone whose carefully constructed plan was unraveling faster than she could control. "Sophia, I think you're creating unnecessary drama during an already stressful time. David's health has to be our primary concern right now." "Dad's health is my concern, but so is protecting him from people who might be taking advantage of his illness to manipulate his legal decisions." I was no longer pretending that Rebecca's behavior was motivated by concern rather than greed. "Are you accusing me of manipulating your father?" "I'm asking you to explain why you've been meeting with real estate agents and attorneys to dispose of property that doesn't legally belong to you." Rebecca sat down across from me with the calculating expression of someone shifting from deception to direct confrontation. "Fine. Let's have this conversation honestly," she said. "David is dying, Sophia. In 6 months, maybe 12 if we're lucky, he'll be gone. When that happens, I'll be a 54-year-old widow with limited income and no permanent housing unless we make arrangements now. You have your own savings, Social Security benefits, and Dad's life insurance. You're not going to be destitute. Life insurance and Social Security don't provide housing security. This house is worth $400,000. Selling it would give me enough money to buy a smaller place and invest the remainder for retirement income." Rebecca was admitting that her concern for Dad's medical expenses had been a lie designed to justify stealing our inheritance for her own financial security. "And what happens to Jake and Emma?" Jake will graduate next year and go to college. Emma will finish high school and start her adult life. Neither of them needs a four-bedroom house. They need the security of knowing they have a permanent home if they face financial difficulties or personal crises. That's why Mom wanted them to inherit this house. Your mother has been dead for 4 years. David's obligations are to his living wife, not to promises he made to someone who can't be affected by his decisions anymore. Rebecca was dismissing our mother's dying wishes as irrelevant to Dad's current situation, while positioning herself as the only person whose financial security mattered. Did you tell Dad about Mom's deed when you convinced him to sign a new will? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her calculating how much truth she could afford to reveal. David was aware that there might be some complications with the property transfer, she said finally. That's not the same thing as full disclosure about his legal limitations. David wanted to provide for my future. We found legal ways to accomplish that goal. Rebecca was admitting that she'd helped Dad circumvent legal protections that were designed to preserve our mother's intentions for her children's inheritance. What legal ways? Rebecca smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone revealing a victory she'd already secured. David added my name to all of his bank accounts, transferred ownership of his car to me, and designated me as the beneficiary of his retirement accounts. The house might be complicated, but everything else will be mine when he dies. I was staring at a woman who'd spent 3 years systematically stealing our father's liquid assets while planning to fight us for the house that represented our mother's legacy. The woman we'd trusted to care for Dad during his final months had been using his terminal illness as cover for the largest theft our family would ever experience. After that devastating conversation with Rebecca, I spent the next week secretly gathering evidence and building a legal strategy to protect Dad from further manipulation before she could complete her theft of our family's assets. Sometimes the most important battle isn't against the disease that's killing your father. It's against the person who's exploiting his illness to destroy his children's future. As a pediatric nurse, I was trained to recognize when adults were exploiting vulnerable people for personal gain. The signs of financial abuse that I watched for in my elderly patients were all present in Rebecca's behavior toward Dad. Isolation from family, pressure to make major financial decisions quickly, and claims that only the caregiver truly understood the victim's needs. But recognizing the abuse and stopping it were very different challenges, especially when the victim was my own dying father who believed he was protecting his wife rather than being manipulated by her. The hardest part of fighting for someone you love is accepting that they might not want to be saved from the person who's destroying them. I started by consulting with the estate planning attorney who'd helped my parents draft their original wills after they bought the house. Margaret Chen had known our family for 15 years and understood the financial security that Mom and Dad had worked to build for their children. The deed structure your parents chose was specifically designed to protect their children's inheritance, Margaret explained during our consultation. David has the right to live in the house until his death, but he cannot sell or transfer ownership without all of you signing consent forms. But what if he's being pressured to sign documents he doesn't understand? That would constitute elder abuse and financial exploitation. If you can prove that David is being manipulated or coerced, we can seek court intervention to protect his assets. I was learning that the law provides protection for victims of financial abuse, but only if their family members are willing to fight for them. Margaret helped me understand that Rebecca's strategy had been sophisticated and partially successful. By convincing Dad to add her name to his bank accounts and change his beneficiary designations, she'd gained control of his liquid assets even though she couldn't legally claim the house. The good news is that the house represents about 60% of your father's total estate value, Margaret said. Even if Rebecca retains control of his other assets, your family would still receive the most valuable part of your inheritance. But she's been planning to sell the house by claiming Dad needs money for medical expenses. She can't sell without your consent, no matter what financial pressures she claims exist, and if she's been lying about the need for medical funds, That could be evidence of fraud. Rebecca's elaborate scheme to steal our inheritance was starting to unravel because she'd overestimated her legal authority and underestimated our family's willingness to fight back. Margaret recommended that I document all of Rebecca's claims about Dad's financial needs and medical expenses to determine whether her justifications for accessing his assets were legitimate. Over the next few days, I carefully reviewed Dad's medical bills, insurance statements, and treatment costs. What I discovered was that his cancer care was almost entirely covered by his excellent health insurance and Medicare supplements. Rebecca's claims about expensive experimental treatments and home modifications were completely fabricated. Dad's actual out-of-pocket medical costs were less than $3,000 per month, easily covered by his pension and Social Security without touching his savings or selling property. Rebecca had been creating financial crises that didn't exist in order to justify stealing assets that Dad didn't need to liquidate. The most disturbing discovery came when I found receipts showing that Rebecca had been using Dad's credit cards for personal expenses that had nothing to do with his medical care. Over the past 3 months, she'd charged $8,000 for clothing, jewelry, spa treatments, and expensive dinners. Rebecca wasn't just planning to steal Dad's inheritance after his death. She was already spending his money on luxuries for herself while claiming she was managing his cancer-related expenses. But the evidence that would prove most valuable came from an unexpected source: Emma. My 14-year-old sister had been keeping a journal about Dad's illness to help her process her feelings about losing another parent. When she showed me some of her entries, I realized that Emma had been documenting conversations and incidents that revealed the scope of Rebecca's manipulation. Sometimes the most important witnesses to family destruction are the children who see everything but aren't considered important enough to lie to. Rebecca told Dad that you and Jake don't visit anymore because seeing him sick makes you uncomfortable, Emma had written. But I know that's not true because you call every day and she always says he's sleeping or too tired for visitors. Emma had recorded Rebecca's lies about our family's behavior, her claims about Dad's medical needs, and her discussions with attorneys and real estate agents. My little sister had been unknowingly building a case against our stepmother while trying to understand why our family was falling apart. Emma, these journal entries are very important, I told her. They show that Rebecca has been lying to Dad about our family. I know she's been lying, Emma said, with the clarity that sometimes comes from being too young to believe that adults always tell the truth. She doesn't want us to spend time with Dad because she's afraid we'll figure out what she's really doing. What do you think she's really doing? Stealing our house. Jake. And I heard her on the phone with someone talking about how much money she'll have after Dad dies. My teenage siblings had understood Rebecca's true intentions, while I'd been giving her the benefit of the doubt and trying to believe her concern for Dad was genuine. Emma's journal entries, combined with the financial evidence I'd gathered and Margaret's legal guidance, gave me everything I needed to expose Rebecca's manipulation and protect Dad from further exploitation. But confronting a financial predator who'd spent 3 years gaining my father's trust was going to require more than evidence. It was going to require convincing a dying man that the woman he'd married to ease his loneliness was actually using his illness to rob his children of their mother's legacy. The next phase of my strategy involved using Rebecca's own manipulation techniques against her while building an airtight case that would force her to return Dad's assets and abandon her plans to steal our inheritance. Sometimes the most effective way to stop a predator is to give them exactly what they want and let them expose their true intentions while you document everything. I stopped confronting Rebecca directly about her financial activities and began presenting myself as a grieving daughter who was overwhelmed by Dad's illness and grateful for her management of complex decisions. This performance gave me access to information about her plans, while she believed I'd given up fighting her control. Rebecca, I want to apologize for being so emotional about the house situation, I said during my next visit. You're right that Dad's health has to be our priority, and I shouldn't be adding stress about financial planning. Rebecca's relief was immediately visible. She'd been prepared for continued resistance, and my apparent surrender made her confident enough to share details about her strategy. I'm glad you understand, Sophia. David has been worried that his children think he's abandoning them, but sometimes difficult decisions are necessary for everyone's long-term benefit. Rebecca was admitting that Dad had expressed concern about his children's feelings, which meant her manipulation was causing him emotional distress that she was choosing to ignore. Over the next week, I visited Dad regularly while maintaining my performance as a cooperative daughter who supported Rebecca's authority. This approach gave me opportunities to observe their interactions and document the techniques she used to control his decisions. Rebecca never directly told Dad what to do. Instead, she presented research and expert opinions that consistently supported her preferred outcomes while making alternatives seem dangerous or irresponsible. The financial planner said that holding on to real estate during a terminal illness can create tax complications for surviving spouses. She'd tell Dad. He recommended liquidating property assets to ensure clean estate transfers. Rebecca was presenting her own agenda as professional advice from experts, making Dad feel like he was making informed decisions rather than being manipulated. When Dad expressed concerns about his children's reactions to major financial changes, Rebecca had ready responses that made his worries seem unrealistic. Sophia is young and emotional right now, but she'll understand the practical necessities once she's had time to process your situation. Adult children always adjust to their parents' end-of-life decisions eventually. Rebecca was training Dad to dismiss his children's objections as temporary emotional reactions that would resolve themselves once we accepted the new reality she was creating. But the most damaging manipulation involved Rebecca's claims about our attitudes toward Dad's illness and her role in our family. Rebecca was systematically poisoning Dad's relationships with his children by misrepresenting our words and actions to support her narrative about family dysfunction. Jake seemed angry during his last visit, Rebecca would report. I think he's having trouble accepting that you have a wife now who needs to be considered in family decisions. Emma has been withdrawn lately. I'm concerned that she's not processing your illness in a healthy way because she's too dependent on Sophia for emotional support instead of learning to talk to the adults who live in this house. Rebecca was interpreting normal teenage responses to family crisis as evidence that Jake and Emma were maladjusted and that our family relationships were dysfunctional. But the recordings I made during these conversations revealed that Dad wasn't as convinced by Rebecca's arguments as she believed. When she left the room, Dad would express doubts about her interpretations and confusion about why his relationships with his children seemed to be deteriorating. I don't understand why Sophia seems so distant lately, he said during one conversation when Rebecca had gone to the pharmacy. She used to call every day, and now she only visits twice a week. Dad, I call every day. Rebecca tells me you're sleeping or too sick to talk. She does? I haven't been sleeping that much during the evenings. Dad was beginning to realize that Rebecca had been filtering his communications with his children and misrepresenting our level of involvement in his care. Rebecca told me yesterday that you and Jake had an argument about his curfew. We talked about his curfew, but it wasn't an argument. He's been coming home on time and helping around the house. I'm actually proud of how he's handling everything. Dad's version of family interactions was completely different from Rebecca's reports, which meant she'd been lying to both sides to create conflict where none existed. The breakthrough came when I asked Dad directly about the financial decisions Rebecca claimed they'd made together. Dad, Rebecca mentioned that you're thinking about selling the house to pay for medical expenses. Are you worried about affording your treatment? Dad looked genuinely confused. I haven't been worried about medical costs. My insurance is covering almost everything, and my savings account has plenty of money for copays and prescriptions. Then why would you need to sell the house? Rebecca said, she said the financial planner recommended it for tax reasons. But I've been thinking about your mother's wishes, and I'm not sure selling is the right decision. Dad was revealing that Rebecca's financial crisis was entirely fabricated and that he'd been having doubts about the decisions she claimed he'd made enthusiastically. What did Mom want regarding the house? She made me promise that you kids would always have the security of our family home. That was very important to her, and it should be important to me, too. Dad remembered Mom's dying wishes clearly, which meant Rebecca's claim that his priorities had changed was another lie designed to justify her theft of our inheritance. That conversation gave me everything I needed to prove that Rebecca had been manipulating Dad through financial deception and emotional manipulation. The woman who thought she'd successfully isolated my father from his children had actually been confessing her crimes to someone who was building a case to stop her. The final confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon when I arrived at the house with Margaret Chen, our family attorney, and copies of all the evidence I'd gathered about Rebecca's financial manipulation and theft. Sometimes, justice arrives quietly, in the form of legal documents that expose years of careful deception in a single afternoon. I'd coordinated the meeting with Margaret to ensure that any legal questions could be addressed immediately and that Rebecca couldn't claim she needed time to research her options or consult with her own attorney. When I rang the doorbell, Rebecca answered with the confident smile of someone who believed she'd successfully neutralized any threat to her control over Dad's assets. "Sophia, honey, what a nice surprise. And you brought a friend?" "This is Margaret Chen, our family's estate planning attorney. We need to have a conversation with you and Dad about some legal documents that have come to our attention." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her composure. "David is having a good day today, but I'm not sure he's up for discussing legal matters. His cognitive function has been affected by the chemotherapy." "Actually, Mrs. Martinez," Margaret interjected, "cognitive impairment from chemotherapy is typically temporary and doesn't affect a patient's ability to understand financial decisions. We'll need to speak with Mr. Martinez directly." Rebecca's excuse for excluding Dad from conversations about his own assets had just been professionally contradicted by a legal expert. We found Dad in the living room reading the newspaper, looking alert and engaged despite Rebecca's claims about his cognitive limitations. When I introduced Margaret, Dad seemed pleased to see our family's attorney again. "Margaret, it's good to see you. How can I help you today?" "David, I need to review some recent changes to your estate planning documents to make sure they comply with the legal structures that you and Maria established for your children's inheritance." Dad looked confused. "I'm not sure what changes you're referring to. Rebecca mentioned that we might need to update some paperwork, but I haven't signed anything final yet." Rebecca stepped forward. "David, honey, remember we met with the attorney last month to discuss financial planning for my future security? We talked to someone, but I thought that was just an informational meeting. I don't remember signing any documents that would change the arrangements Maria and I made for the kids." Dad was revealing that Rebecca had misrepresented their legal consultations and that he hadn't knowingly authorized the changes she'd been claiming were his decisions. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out copies of the original deed to our house, Mom's will, and the estate planning documents that she'd helped our parents create. "David, when you and Maria bought this house, you specifically chose a ownership structure that would protect your children's inheritance. Do you remember those conversations?" "Of course. Maria was very concerned that the kids would always have security if something happened to both of us. We wanted to make sure they'd never lose their family home. According to the deed, you have a life estate in this property, but ownership will transfer to your children when you die. You cannot sell or transfer the house without their written consent." Dad looked relieved. "Good. That's exactly what Maria and I intended." Rebecca's face had gone completely white as she listened to Margaret explain the legal protections that invalidated her plans to sell our family home. "But surely David has the right to make changes if his circumstances have changed significantly," Rebecca said, with decreasing confidence. "Actually, the deed structure specifically prevents those changes," Margaret replied. It was designed to protect the children's inheritance even if David remarried or faced financial pressures. Rebecca was discovering that all of her legal maneuvering had been powerless against the protective measures our parents had established 15 years earlier. David, Margaret continued, I also need to ask you about some financial accounts that were reportedly changed to include Rebecca as a beneficiary or joint owner. Dad looked confused again. What accounts? Your checking account, savings account, retirement fund, and life insurance policy. I remember Rebecca saying something about making her an authorized user on the checking account for household expenses, but I didn't think that changed the ownership. According to bank records, Rebecca has been added as a joint owner with survivorship rights, which means she would inherit those accounts when you die, instead of your children. Dad's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. That's not what I intended. I wanted Rebecca to be able to pay bills and manage household expenses, not inherit money that should go to my kids. Dad was realizing that Rebecca had tricked him into signing documents that gave her rights he'd never intended to grant. Rebecca, is this true? Dad asked, turning to face his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. David, you're not thinking clearly. The chemotherapy is affecting your memory and judgment. We discussed all of these decisions together, and you agreed that I needed financial security after you're gone. I remember our conversations, and I never agreed to disinherit my children. I wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable, but not at the expense of Jake, Emma, and Sophia's inheritance. Your children are young and capable of supporting themselves. I'm 54 years old with limited income potential. I need the security of your assets to maintain my lifestyle after you die. Rebecca was abandoning any pretense that her financial planning had been motivated by Dad's wishes rather than her own greed. Margaret pulled out another set of documents. David, I also have evidence that Rebecca has been using your credit cards for personal expenses that aren't related to your medical care or household needs. She showed Dad the receipts I'd gathered documenting Rebecca's spending on clothing, jewelry, and luxury items. $8,000 in 3 months for personal purchases, while claiming you needed to sell the house to afford medical expenses. Dad stared at the receipts with growing anger. Rebecca, you told me we were struggling to afford my treatment costs. We are struggling. Medical expenses are more complicated than just doctor bills and prescriptions. Spa treatments and designer clothes aren't medical expenses. Rebecca realized that her careful manipulation was completely unraveling and that Dad was seeing her actions clearly for the first time. David, you're being influenced by your children, who want to make sure they inherit as much money as possible. They don't care about your happiness or your wife's security. Even when confronted with evidence of her theft, Rebecca was still trying to manipulate Dad by portraying his children as greedy and unsupportive. My children have never asked me for money or pressured me about inheritance, Dad replied with quiet firmness. But my wife has been lying to me about our finances and stealing from accounts that we're supposed to provide for my kids' futures. Margaret placed a legal document on the coffee table. David, I've prepared paperwork that will restore your original estate planning structure and remove Rebecca's unauthorized access to your accounts. If you'd like to provide for Rebecca's future, we can do that through legitimate means that don't disinherit your children. Dad picked up the pen without hesitation. Yes, I want to fix this immediately. As Dad signed the documents restoring his original will and removing Rebecca's access to his accounts, she realized that her 3-year plan to steal our inheritance had completely collapsed. You're making a mistake, she said with cold fury. Your children have manipulated you into abandoning the woman who's cared for you during the most difficult time of your life. Dad looked up from the documents with an expression of profound sadness. The mistake was trusting someone who saw my terminal illness as an opportunity to rob my children, rather than a chance to support our family during a crisis. Rebecca left our house that afternoon with only the personal belongings she'd brought to the marriage 3 years earlier. The woman who'd planned to inherit everything our parents had built together walked away with nothing but the knowledge that her years of manipulation had been exposed and stopped before she could complete her theft. 8 months later, I stood in the garden behind our family home, helping Dad plant the roses that Mom had loved, and reflected on how close we'd come to losing everything to someone we'd trusted to protect our family during its most vulnerable time. Sometimes the greatest gift that betrayal can give you is clarity about the difference between people who support your family and people who exploit your family's trust for personal gain. Dad's cancer treatment had been more successful than his oncologist initially predicted. While we couldn't call it a cure, his tumors had responded well to chemotherapy, and he'd gained several additional months of good quality time with Jake and Emma. More importantly, removing Rebecca's influence from his daily life had allowed Dad to focus on healing both physically and emotionally, without the constant stress of managing someone else's financial schemes, disguised as family planning. The house was peaceful again, filled with the kind of love that builds families up rather than dividing them for personal advantage. We learned that genuine care creates stability and security, while manipulation disguised as care creates anxiety and confusion, even when the victim can't identify the source of their distress. Jake graduated from high school that spring with Dad cheering from the audience, and Emma finished 8th grade with renewed confidence in her family's stability. Both kids had struggled during Rebecca's manipulation period, not because they couldn't handle Dad's illness, but because they'd sensed the deception in our family dynamics, without being able to understand its source. "I never liked how Rebecca made you and Dad argue about things," Emma told me during one of our conversations about the experience. "Before she moved in, you and Dad always agreed about important stuff. After she came, it seemed like someone was always angry or upset about something." Children are remarkably sensitive to emotional manipulation, even when they can't articulate what they're observing. Emma and Jake had both felt the tension that Rebecca created through her constant crisis management and manufactured conflicts. But they'd been too young to understand that they were witnessing systematic family destruction. Protecting children from manipulation requires listening to their instincts about family dynamics, even when they can't explain why something feels wrong. The legal resolution had been swift once Margaret documented the extent of Rebecca's financial deception. The bank accounts were restored to Dad's control, the beneficiary designations were returned to their original structure, and Rebecca was required to repay the money she'd stolen through unauthorized credit card charges. She'd also been reported to Adult Protective Services for financial elder abuse, though Dad had chosen not to pursue criminal charges because he wanted to focus his remaining energy on healing rather than legal battles. Margaret had helped us understand that Rebecca's manipulation tactics were sophisticated enough to suggest that Dad wasn't her first victim. "Financial predators typically develop these skills through practice," Margaret explained. "The techniques she used are consistent with someone who's exploited vulnerable adults before, and refined her approach based on previous success. The woman who'd targeted our family had probably destroyed other families before us, and might have continued her pattern of elder abuse if we hadn't fought back." But perhaps the most important healing came from the conversations that Dad and I were finally able to have about Mom's death, his grief, and his decision to remarry. "I was so lonely after your mother died," Dad told me during one of our garden sessions. "I thought I needed someone to take care of me and help me figure out how to be a single parent to teenagers. Did Rebecca make you feel less lonely?" Dad was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "No, actually. She made me feel managed rather than loved. But I was so grateful to have someone handling difficult decisions that I convinced myself that management was a form of care." "What's the difference?" "When your mother cared for me, she helped me become stronger and more capable. When Rebecca managed me, she made me feel dependent and confused about my own judgment." Dad had learned to recognize the difference between love that empowers and manipulation that creates dependency. The most difficult conversations were about forgiveness and trust. Dad felt guilty about how close he'd come to betraying Mom's wishes and disinheriting his children, even though his actions had been the result of systematic manipulation rather than conscious choice. "I should have seen what she was doing," he said repeatedly. "I should have protected you better." Dad, recognizing manipulation is hard when you're grieving and sick, and the manipulator is someone you live with every day. Rebecca spent 3 years studying our family's weaknesses and developing strategies to exploit them. "But I almost let her steal your mother's legacy." "Almost isn't the same as actually. You stopped her when you understood what was really happening." Recovery from family manipulation requires forgiveness for the victims as well as consequences for the predators. 6 months after Rebecca left, Dad started dating again, but this time with very different criteria for evaluating potential partners. He was looking for someone who enhanced his existing relationships rather than someone who tried to replace or manage them. "I want someone who celebrates my children rather than competing with them," he told me. "Someone who adds to our family's happiness rather than someone who needs to control our family's resources." Dad had learned that healthy relationships strengthen existing family bonds rather than requiring people to choose between old loyalties and new ones. If you're reading this because someone in your family is offering help that feels controlling, trust your instincts. Genuine support empowers families to handle their own challenges more effectively. Manipulation disguised as support creates dependency and confusion while isolating people from their natural support systems. Pay attention to whether assistance makes your family stronger or whether it creates conflict where none existed before. Notice whether helpers respect your family's existing relationships or subtly undermine them. Ask yourself whether the help you're receiving comes with expectations that you never agreed to accept. Most importantly, remember that people who truly love your family want you to maintain strong relationships with each other. They don't try to position themselves as replacements for existing family bonds or create situations where family members have to choose sides. Rebecca taught us that some people view family crisis as an opportunity for personal gain rather than a chance to provide genuine support. But our experience fighting back taught us that families can protect themselves from predators when they work together and refuse to accept manipulation disguised as care. Margaret helped us understand that elder abuse often succeeds because families are afraid to question caregivers who seem helpful and dedicated. But protecting vulnerable family members sometimes requires challenging people who claim to have their best interests at heart. The greatest gift we gave Dad wasn't just protecting his assets from theft, it was showing him that his children loved him enough to fight for his well-being even when fighting was difficult and uncomfortable. Rebecca thought she could steal our inheritance by convincing Dad that his children didn't understand his needs or care about his happiness. Instead, she taught us how much we valued each other and how hard we were willing to fight to protect our family from people who would exploit our love for personal gain. Recovery from family manipulation isn't just about removing the manipulator. It's about rebuilding trust in your own judgment and learning to recognize the difference between people who support your family's well-being and people who exploit your family's vulnerabilities. The greatest protection you can give your family is the security that comes from knowing you'll fight for each other against anyone who would divide you for their own benefit, even when that someone has convinced you that their exploitation is actually love. Have you ever experienced financial manipulation from someone you trusted during a family crisis? How did you recognize the difference between genuine support and predatory behavior? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might help someone else protect their family from similar exploitation. Subscribe for more stories about recognizing and stopping elder abuse disguised as family care.